the game fair, there were quite a few people who were talking about changes to the law on sound moderators. And yeah, just if you're interested in this, if it's relevant to you, it's a one-stop shop, Fraser, or maybe talk through some of the changes. So Fraser, what has changed? What is new with sound moderators? Why is that a subject people want to talk about just now?
Okay, so on the 29th of June of this year, the commencement order for the Crime and Policing Act 2026 for Section 44 was commenced, which basically meant that sound moderators were deregulated. The actual commencement order came a wee bit out of the blue to shooting organisations. It hadn't been well communicated by the Home Office to say when it was going to actually occur. And as a result of that, there was a kind of mad scramble on the day to get information out. But now we're, three and a half weeks down the line, and after the potentially initial, not confusion, but uncertainty about what kind of advice everyone was going to put out, that's kind of settled down now. So we're in a much stronger position now to kind of go over what the actual act meant. I mean, we were fairly well cited in relation to what it meant, but it was the practicalities of, well, what were the police going to do? What was going to happen in relation to authorities which were already on tickets, slots on tickets, etc., etc. So we're much better placed. A couple of wee tiny anomalies which potentially people were cited on and had thought about, but however probably they've come more to the fore. And that's one of the big things is about security. And watching the forums when people are asking about security. So just for the absolute record, these sound moderators are no longer subject to the conditions of a firearms certificate. They have been removed from certification and been required to be on a firearms certificate. And to possess a sound moderator in England, Wales and Scotland, well, England and Wales first, because it's slightly different in Scotland, you've got to be in possession of either a firearm or a shotgun certificate. So to actually be in possession of a firearm certificate, a sound moderator. And that basically means that you've got to have a certificate because you've gone through all the kind of quality assurance tests in relation to you being suitable to hold what was previously a component part. And so you've got to have a certificate. Now, the security, people have said, do you need to keep them in your cabinet or whatever? And the answer to that is no. There's no legal requirement to keep sound moderators in a security cabinet when not in use. However, right, common sense says, or my advice would be, just continue keeping them in the cabinet, because you can leave them in your kitchen worktop and then go out, and if your partner, children, or whoever, parents are in the house and they don't have a certificate, and for whatever reason that the police come to, for whatever reason, right, they're in the house with the certificate, with the sound moderator, it's not locked away. They're technically at that point in possession of a sound moderator without a certificate to cover it, right? Or you not being a certificate holder. Now, the chances of that happening are actually fairly remote, I would suggest. However, you don't want to be the test case. You don't want to be the first person that a prosecutor is looking at, or a police officer is reporting to the prosecution service, whether it be in England and Wales or in Scotland, and then the prosecutor going, this will be a first, this will be a test case, because what that will do will incur lots of money getting spent by solicitors to defend you for something you should just basically put, when it could be stopped by just keeping it in your cabinet, right? You don't have to keep it in your cabinet, but however, if there's other people in your house, just keep it in your cabinet, because it just means that it negates the possibility of anything like that happening and someone getting a copy complaint from whatever prosecution service through their door and then saying you have to be at the court on such and such a date and you're charged with this, and then that just incurs a whole pile of legal fees which you don't need to go down the road of. So that's my advice. My advice is just to be sensible about it and put them away.
it's quite a simple change in practice. Then there's a certain amount of common sense to it as well. But are there any things that you're interested in watching here from a legal perspective? I mean, what might come next?
The implications are, and I spoke to the head of firearms licensing this morning, and to find prior to this podcast to find out how the change had gone in Police Scotland, and that this is replicated, or this will be replicated throughout the UK, because it's reserved legislation. But they've noticed a huge decrease in admin for variations for one for firearms, for sound moderators. So all that, like a variation for someone changing their certification over, that's all gone. That just has gone straight out the window. So they're saying, well, the chief inspector there is reporting that it's been to be welcomed, and it'll absolutely settle down. But they've noticed a big decrease in the amount of admin that they're doing for that. And of course, if they're not doing that, if they're not dealing with the admin in relation to variations for sound moderators, they can do something else in relation to processing applications or whatever. But it's just a task that they don't have to do anymore. So I think it's a really good thing. One of the differences in Scotland is that for small bore certificate, for small bore 0.22, say for instance, but a small bore sound moderator, if you've got an air weapon certificate, then the air weapon certificate also covers that. So that covers a sound moderator as well, which it's not required in England and Wales because air weapons aren't certificated down there, whereas in Scotland they are. But if you've got an air weapon certificate and you've got a small bore moderator, then and you've got an air weapon certificate, then that also covers you. What it doesn't cover you for is a large bore, or something for a firearm, a 6.5 Creedmoor or a 308 or something like that, in relation to a sound moderator for that. It wouldn't, you would have to prove that if you only had an air weapon certificate and you didn't have a firearm certificate, then you might find yourself in a bit of stick trying to explain to the police why you've got it. But for small bore sound moderators for air weapons in Scotland, your air weapon certificate covers it. This piece of legislation had a really fast transit from the decision getting made by the Home Office to say we will do this. Everybody agreed, and everyone's agreed for years, including the police. When I was in the police at Fellweg and so on, they were discussing that we don't need sound moderators on ticket, and desperately trying to get rid of them. But for that was all caught up in Brexit, the Brexit legislation, and the government eventually, or Westminster eventually trying to clear its feet of all the post-Brexit legislation, pre-Brexit legislation. And you would go to meetings and the Home Office policy officials would be saying, we'd love to, but we can't because everything's taken up with Brexit and so on, parliamentary time. And then things are being cleared. It's 10 years since Brexit. But I don't think people realise that how strong the tailwind was in relation to that, because everybody was sitting nodding in agreement round at these meetings. Shooting organisations, the police, Home Office, we're all agreeing we need to move to get these things taken off a ticket, but it just takes time. I spoke to a member this morning actually who asked about 10-year certification, and I suppose going back to your previous question, what would you like to see happen next? And the extension of certification would be a good thing in relation to 10 years, but I think the police are nervous about that nationally in relation to the robustness of their command and control system, to be able to flag addresses and the confidence that if the police go in one force and they're a firearm certificate holder, would that be then flagged up in another force and so on in relation to...
Sure.
And it's fairly straightforward in Scotland because it is one force, and you look down the line as well, and you've got the Home Secretary talking about reviewing policing processes and the number of forces. Now, firearms licensing has got to be part of that, without a shadow of a doubt. You've got a national force in Scotland, amalgamated 8 forces into one national firearms licensing system, and it can that can deliver 98.2% of certificates prior to expiry, right? And colleagues in Basque will highlight this, and I've been highlighting it for ages. If you've got a national force, which is realistically a model for England and Wales, but if you've got a national force which also licenses their weapons, can deliver 98.2% of certificates prior to expiry, and you've got some forces in England and Wales who are delivering 13%. Right? You don't have this nonsense about your certificates expires, you're going to have to put it in stock. There are some forces down south that when we tell members just to phone them up and say, I can't afford the cost of putting these guns into an RFD, just put them in their armoury, and then it's laughable insofar as you get some forces, due to their inefficiencies, their armouries are full with certificate holders' guns. And it's just like, you couldn't make it up in relation to some of the poorer performing forces down in England and Wales in relation to what their impact is on the actual service delivery of a function, and it's a statutory function. There's no real excuse for it. But this is a good piece of legislation in relation to taking sound moderators off, and it's just to be welcomed.
Yeah, fair enough.
The other types of things, I suppose, is that that people have asked, or members have asked me, what happened to my current certificate in relation to it. Now, you could just put a line through your current certificate in relation to sound moderators and say no longer certificated. And then when your certificate goes in for renewal, it'll come back without a sound moderator mentioned on it, because they're not part of the certification now, which is a really good thing. And the other thing is about, can you buy sound moderators remotely? Yes, you can. Right? Do you need to go into an RFD to be able to buy one? No, you don't. Does it need to go through anybody's books now? No, it doesn't. Not post 29th of June. Also costs, saves folk a pile of money. Instead of spending £49 or so for a variation, don't have to pay any money.
Sure, which is, that's welcome. Even in its own right, that's welcome.
Hugely.